We should call it life in the blender because that's what it feels like. The state of work in many organizations today of constant change and disruption, one thing after the next. Whether that is the new strategy or the reorg or the new leader or the new piece of software that, by the way, nobody asked for, but suddenly it's there overnight and you can't do your work. This is basically the texture of the work world today. It's not one change at a time. It's many changes on top of one another in an endless succession. The human organism does not thrive in conditions of constant change. If you are a leader of an organization that contains humans, that finding should have some bearing on how you lead.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Companies, especially the biggest ones, seem to be in constant change. One week, teams are navigating new project management systems. The next week, they need to adapt to new org structures. Titles change, roles change, management changes. Even office layouts seem to change to match the company's latest pivot. Expert Ashley Goodall calls it life in the blender and says it's damaging companies. In his latest book, The Problem with Change, he highlights the true harm caused by constant change and advocates for the pursuit of stability. Ashley is a leadership expert, consultant, and author who has spent his career exploring large organizations from the inside out. He most recently served as senior vice president at Cisco, where he led organizations focused on leadership, teams, and research. Prior to Cisco, he also served as director and chief learning officer at Deloitte. Ashley's previous books include 9 Lies About Work, which was selected as one of Amazon's best business and leadership books during its release year. Ashley has also written for the Harvard Business Review, including the most popular article of 2019 called The Feedback Fallacy. In this episode, Ashley and I discuss the cognitive and emotional burden of constant change in the workplace, how consultants play a role in these continuous shifts, and the difference between making improvements to a company and simply making changes. We also talk about the unique and isolated world of an executive, HR's role as the bridge between leaders and the front line, the psychological effects of layoffs, and other topics. If you enjoy Ashley's insights today, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Ashley Goodall. Ashley Goodall, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thanks, Dart.
So your recent book, The Problem with Change, comes as almost a physical relief for me to read. And I was surprised. By my reaction to it. I didn't know what to expect when I opened it up. But you describe a problem that I and others, my friends, my family, have lived in our whole professional careers when you describe the problem of change. And your first chapter is called Life in the Blender. What is the blender?
It's interesting to think about the power of giving names to things. And so you talk about the sense of relief. I don't know, because you and I haven't talked about it, but it might be that some of that relief comes from my affixing a name to a thing and saying, hey, not only is this a thing, but there's a thing we can call the thing. And we should call it life in the blender because that's what it feels like. And what life in the blender describes is the state of work in many organizations today of constant change and disruption, one thing after the next. Whether that is the new strategy or the reorg or the new leader or the new technology or the new process or the new approval thing or the new office plan or the new piece of software that, by the way, nobody asked for, but suddenly it's there overnight and you can't do your work. I spoke to dozens of people around the world about change at work. And what I heard was not a lot of enthusiasm, an awful lot of weariness, and the overwhelming impression you came away with was that this is basically the texture of the work world today. It's not one change at a time, it's many changes on top of one another in an endless succession. And so I was looking for a name for all of that, and I landed, I think very fortuitously, on Life in the Blender. And people I've spoken to immediately get that. Leaders maybe a little less, but people who live in it, people who don't get a vote on it, people who are on the receiving end of it, you say to them, it's like Life in the Blender, isn't it? And before you've explained very much what that is, they go, yes, that's what it's like. And it's really hard for me to do my job if my leaders keep mashing the buttons.
And I'll tell you why naming it is so important is that it's so ambient that I thought it might be a law of physics. I think particularly importantly, there's a sense that the rate of change in companies is coming from external forces, that the rate of change in companies is something that's being driven by the emergence of new technologies or the emergence of new markets or the emergence of new. But a lot of what you're saying is, no, this is simply self-inflicted damage.
I think you can say no, or you can say yes and. The main conclusion is there's an awful lot of it. Does understanding the sources of the awful lot of it change how we should respond to it in some way? I don't know. It just lets us know there's an awful lot of it. If constant change harms people, which there's a lot of evidence that it does, then part of the role of leadership is to diminish the amount of change or provide some sort of stability or actually put a lid on all of this stuff. Now, I suppose if some of it is coming from the outside, there is a natural limitation to how much you can limit it. But actually, the way that stability works is we can think of stability not as the absence of change, but as a way to fortify people against change. And so it's not actually sort of a zero-sum scale. It is true that, a couple of studies have found that the amount of change in organizations, the amount that we are creating for ourselves, has increased something like 5-fold in the last 4 or 5 years. So there's data that, the old cliche that the rate of change is increasing and the rate of change isn't, and all of that stuff. There's some evidence that that's a thing and we could do something about it. But the main point of the argument is simply to help people see that the human organism does not thrive in conditions of constant change, and that if you are a leader of an organization that contains humans, that finding should have some bearing on how you lead. That's what we're trying to get into the conversation here.
And I want to get into the specifics of that. But before we do, what is the cult of disruption?
One of the things you have to ask yourself in exploring the world of constant change is, why do we do this? Where does it all come from? How old is the idea that change and disruption that we do to ourselves are a good and necessary thing? Where's the origin of the idea that if you're a leader, you were sent there to change stuff? Where does that all come from? Because if you go back, 100 years, 200 years, 50 years, I'm not sure it's nearly as prevalent in the thinking about business that job number one leader is shake things up. So the cult of disruption is an exploration towards the beginning of the book of the origins of the idea. And the nature of ideas is not typically it comes from one place, it comes from a few places. But if you were going to pick a date, you would say 1997, Clayton Christensen, The Innovator's Dilemma, is when this begins. And I would argue that that is a massively misunderstood book. And in a way, a tragically misunderstood book. Because what Clayton Christensen was identifying, and some people have said he was wrong, this was a selective set of samples and actually it's not a thing. But if we just take it on its face, he was identifying a process where new entrants to a market, because they have fewer economic constraints and fewer established constituencies than the big players, can create a product at a different price point, a different feature set. It doesn't have to be as good. They find new markets to go to. They find customers who are willing to pay a little bit more for something a little bit less good because they're after a different thing, Big companies don't do this sort of thing because their customers are annoyed if the product gets worse. Big companies don't do this thing because their investors are annoyed if they lose money. New companies can do all of those things. New companies will eat the lunch of established companies. That's the innovator's dilemma in a nutshell. And we can accept that on its face. Although, as I said, some people question that. But what happens is that then it becomes a slogan. And all of a sudden, the mantra is you have to disrupt yourself. Because if you're a leader of a large organization and you're not disrupting yourself, someone else will do it to you or for you or at you. And before long, we've got courses in disruption, and we've got fail fast, and we've got move fast and break things, and we've got slogans, and we've got pretty much an unthinking acceptance on the part of leaders that the act of leading is the act of disrupting. Meanwhile, if you read all the way to the end of The Innovator's Dilemma and look at the prescription that Clayton Christensen himself offers, what he says is, here's the thing to do. Take a small group of people, send them off by themselves, get them a different building, get them a secured budget, get them a clear mission, get them a nice stable team, and ask them to come up with innovative products, remove them from the constraints of the large organization, and allow them to set sail in a little boat by themselves, spin them out, or spin them off, or bring them back in, or hive them off, or protect them from the incentive structure of a large organization. And you listen to those things and you go, small team, off by itself, clear mission, clear funding, leave them alone. And that's a recipe for stability. That ain't disruption. So the disrupt thing, I think, has been massively misunderstood. To that, add a little bit of, it sounds a little Darwinian, which people like. It sounds like creative destruction, which people like. It allows you to say the sort of Friedman shareholder value thing is right front and center in how we should do these things. So it meets a lot of ideas about how to run an organization. The idea that it doesn't meet is that if your organization is made up of human beings, then helping the humans do their job is probably a good idea somewhere along the way.
To what extent do you feel that consultants are carriers of this belief system? And I say that because a common refrain in a consultant's pitch is the world is changing. If you don't run to keep up, you're going to fall behind. And if you're centralized, I think you should decentralize. If you're decentralized, I think you should centralize. And I can't sell not change, but I can sell change.
By the way, I would love a consulting company out there to start selling stability, because I think there's an amazing opportunity to be made from that. And I think it's scientifically supportable and intuitively clear to a lot of people. So you can sell things that aren't change, is my point, but you do actually have to try. More broadly, I think it's very easy to treat all consulting as monolithic. And I think this is actually part of the problem, because there are all sorts of consultants who are specialists in a particular thing. And what you're essentially doing is renting their expertise. So you're renting a marketing expert, or you're renting a communications expert, or you're renting a legal expert. And I think when it's very clear what you're renting, and that's something more specific than management advice, then I think there's a lot of good there. And a lot of companies will reach out to a consultant because they don't want to have a full-time A, B, or C on their payroll. They need advice on this right now, and you find an expert and the expert gives you advice. Where it gets a little tricky is where you build an ecosystem where the expert who you're paying for now needs to provide care and feeding for a bunch of junior folks. And so there's a lot of incentive to sell large, complicated projects. And as you observed, a lot of large, complicated projects look more like change and less like stability. And I've been through this on both sides of the aisle, as it were. I've sat there as a junior consultant when a consulting firm I was part of was trying to figure out how to reclaim a client who had done a merger. Somebody said in my hearing, "Oh, let's just do a spans and levels for them. They'll probably need one of them." And what that meant was, let's go through and rationalize the org chart. And we can guess that whatever state their org chart is in, we can make an argument that the spans of control need to be changed and that the number of levels of leadership should be different than it is. And that's a whole bunch of lovely work, because then you've got to map everyone in the organization to different jobs. So that was borderline cynical, if you ask me. So I've seen that. I've been in organizations where a consultant has come in and said, this is the operating model you should be in because A, B, and C. The incentives are not necessarily aligned, and very often the incentives of a consulting company is to keep their consultants employed and on the ground. And I think we could all be a little more clear-sighted about that, which is not to say that expertise does not have value, but to say that not all consulting is primarily about expertise.
That's right. And I want to trace the incentives. In my life, I've been the smoothie in the blender, but much more often I've been the blades. And the reason is, some of it is that it's fun. It's interesting work to be leading big changes. It's nice to be close to the axis at the middle that's not moving quite as fast. It's the safest place to be. And also, if you're in the smoothie and you're the person saying, excuse me, wait a minute, I'm not sure this is a good idea, then you're seen as change resistant. You're a problem. And everybody's incented in the smoothie to be champions of the change, whatever it is.
Or to say that they are.
Oh, well, no, that's what I mean. That's what I mean by saying it is, well, and as a manager, I actually feel like it's my responsibility, because if I introduce a whole bunch of angst into my team, it's not good for them. If I say this is a terrible idea and they believe me, they are hostage to the zeitgeist, I guess. And so I've learned a way to do that, by the way, which if we want, we can talk about it. But I want to start at the top, which is I recognize the challenge of leaders who are tasked with doing something. They're tasked with doing something, and they definitely don't want to appear to be doing nothing. And there are not many levers on the machine for them. They can't go down to the weave of the shirt of the company and change the threads, but they can change the cut of the shirt. And so that's what they do. And it feels productive and it feels visible. I guess you say a sentence that I think is really important, which is that to some extent, executives live in an entirely different universe. What is that universe, and what are the incentives inside that universe?
The universe is, it depends slightly on the size of the company. But if you're talking about companies that someone once described to me as XXL companies, they're really big multinationals. The universe of an executive is most of your compensation is in stock. So the stock price determines really what your take is in a given year if you're selling the stock. And it certainly feels like the value of the award when it comes your way is massively dependent on the stock price. So then the magnitude of the amount of money you're being paid is massively different. The ratio of average CEO pay to average frontline worker pay is now just a hair below 400 to 1. So you say a different world, it's 400 times different, if you like. So there's a lot of money. There's a lot of money that's mainly in stock. There are a lot of people surrounding you to tell you what to do and how things are going. And it's very hard, even with the best will in the world, to figure out what's actually going on because, and I've done this and experienced this, you're suddenly the person where when you walk into the room, everybody turns around and looks at you. You become the capital L leader, and all leaders here now. And we don't say things to upset the leader because that might harm our careers. So there's to a very real extent, information does not want to flow up a power gradient. Good information likes to go there more quickly. Bad information certainly doesn't like to flow uphill in an organization. And even if you sit down and you're a senior leader, you sit down one-on-one with people and go, just tell me what's going on, they freak out a little bit. I mean, I used to do all sorts of skip levels as an SVP at Cisco, and I would say, listen, find space on my calendar. We'll talk about anything you want to talk about. And people would go, well, I'm a little hesitant to come and talk to you. And I'm like, I'm just me. I'm a curious person. Yeah, but you're also the big boss. And so I've got to be guarded about what I say to you. And this is a moment of career inflection for me if it goes badly. So there's an information moat, if you like, surrounding senior people, and there is a compensation moat surrounding senior people, and there is a company performance/stock moat surrounding senior people, in that if you're on one side of the moat, you want the short-term performance to look really good. And if you're on the employee side of the moat, actually what you're interested in is long-term stability, because you want a nice stable paycheck and you want to be able to invest in a career there. And, we're taught that a moat is a really good thing in business. A moat is a way to stop people taking your market share. But an interior moat in a company is a really bad thing. And these moats exist. There are people inside the moat with the best will in the world, challenged to find out what's going on outside the moat. And meanwhile, if you're inside the moat, as you said, there are only a few things you can do, and making sweeping change is one of them. And in a way, it's refreshing because lots of the other things you can do are indirect. You can't actually go and fix the product yourself. You can't create the marketing campaign. You can't hire thousands of people a year by interviewing them all yourself. You have to encourage other people to do these things. And so if you are frustrated by operating at 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 removes from the scene of the action, and a consultant, to our earlier conversation, comes in and says, hey, sweeping change initiative, you're like, finally, I can shape this. I can bridge the moat. I can span the moat. This allows me to cross the moat. All of these things reinforce one another, which is, I think, a lot of the reason why we're in the environment of constant change that we're in.
I can affirm that the thing that you said about the information moat. There was a time when I was working for the COO at Cisco. And so I would go out to do things on his behalf. And as soon as I came in as that representative, people started lying to me. And it was almost always completely transparent. It was almost like kabuki. It was like an agreed upon dance. I'm going to lie to you. It was very defensive. One person actually said out loud, I said, do you do this thing? He says, no, we don't do this thing, but let's say we do it 100%. And I said, you don't do it. And they said, no, we don't do it. Then I'll say 0%. And he says, no, yeah, I know, but I mean, that's exactly what they said. So yeah, that's absolutely right. And then given the opportunity to do something, especially because you're being watched by the board, and the board ultimately, and the major shareholders are the ones who are saying, you're here to do something, right? It is a tough situation.
And just to say, I'm not arguing that people should not do things. And I'm not arguing that some of the things don't involve change. Improvement and change aren't the same thing. One is a subset of the other. What I'm arguing against is change that is not improvement. And I think most people would go, well, there's not very much of that, is there? And I would go, you should talk to people on the front lines. It feels like most change is not improvement. So the challenge for a leader coming in and being tasked to change something is actually to ask a different question. Hear that as improve something. Now, if I said to you, go into this organization and improve something, your first question would be, what's broken? And you would start asking about what's broken, and you would be led by that. What's weird is that if I send you in there and go change something, what you tend to do, I think, is draw a picture of the everything and figure out how to change as much of it as possible, in line with, I don't know, a theory of organization or the way you've done it before, or something that you brought with you. So there's a weird and insidious way in which change something invites a leader to impose their own pre-existing conceptions, or their favorite consultant's pre-existing conceptions, on an organization. But improve something kind of gets you a little bit more into listening mode. Now, it's not a super tight distinction, but it's very interesting to be able to suggest a sort of thought experiment to a leader arriving on day one of the new job, to say, you know what, your first task should be to identify and articulate all the things which are working and will not change. And that's actually day one through day whatever, in whatever 90-day plan we're doing or 180-day plan. You should start by figuring out what works, because in doing that, you will understand the organization. And in communicating that, you will lower the level of anxiety and stress in everybody who's working there at the moment, because they've seen new leaders before and they know what usually happens on day one. And what usually happens on day one is some version of, you poor people, you had no idea how awful things were here, but thank goodness me, I've arrived now. So boy, are we going to have some change, and it's going to be fantastic. That message is never heard, by the way, as it's going to be fantastic.
What is the effect on people in the organization specifically? And to some extent, this is a question of who are people and how do they react to change, and how do they cognitively react? How do they emotionally react? Why is it such a challenge?
We were talking a little bit ago about change resistance. There's another word for change resistance. It's human. We don't think of it like that. We think change resistance is people being sort of curmudgeonly or set in their ways, or that in some way, if we can say, adjust your mindset, another favorite word, that you can change your mindset of change resistance into a mindset of change leadership, change acceptance. But actually, if you look at the psychological effects of change on the human animal, what you find out is a bunch of stuff that looks an awful lot like change resistance. So I think we need to stop putting people in a bucket and say, there's something wrong with you and you're not a team player because change is upsetting to you. And instead go, change is upsetting to humans, and that upset makes it harder for them to do their jobs. How can we minimize the amount of change? So just to get into the categories a little bit, this is not a model of change. These are the groupings that I've found most useful to categorize the research. But roughly speaking, we can think of change resistance, aka being human, under 5 headings. One is the uncertainty. When somebody says a change is coming, new leader. Uncertainty is very hard on us, causes stress, causes physiological reactions. A lack of control. Change is coming and I'll tell you what it is soon. So, lack of control, lack of agency is similarly hard on people and leads to a category of set of behaviors called learned helplessness, which in modern lingo is phoning it in, which again, we don't want quiet quitting. We don't want lazy girl jobs. We don't want people doing the minimum. But if you tell people that they don't control their outcomes at work, that whatever they do, there's no cause and effect, then sooner or later they just phone it in. So that's lack of control. Massively important is the sense of belonging. So when you shuffle all the teams around, you break up a bunch of social groups and social relationships and create unbelonging, if you like. And social groups are massively important to how we define ourselves, how we think, and how we get stuff done. Underpinning all of these is not just how we feel, it's how we act and how productive we are and how we can contribute to organizations. So unbelonging. There is a beautiful set of findings about place and about ritual and rhythm and the connection between how we move through the world and that sense of place that emerges from that. Of course, when we move people from one office to another or one set of team rituals to another, we're essentially disturbing the place that they've located for themselves. That makes it much harder to do work. And then the last one is the lack of meaning. Organizations like to or tend to talk about meaning and purpose. Those are the two that go together, meaning and purpose. And where that conversation tends to go to is every organization should have some sort of aspirational do good work in the universe statement, and that will be useful to people. And it seems that those sorts of lofty ideals are helpful to people and are important to people in doing their work. There are a couple of problems. One is that foundational to having a sense of what this organization is for is a sense that this organization actually makes sense. And constant change pulls apart the coherence of an organization. 6 weeks ago, we were all about this, and this was the shiny new thing. Now we're all about this, and this is the shiny new thing. Well, both of those can't be true. I'm worried that there isn't a this that we're all about, or that we don't know what it is. So that sense of spiraling incoherence means that it's impossible to go, well, my organization exists to do this in the world. The second problem about the lofty sense of purpose, what an organization signifies, is that actually that is more frequently emergent in a person. We arrive at our own answers to that question, and we can't necessarily affiliate with the answers that our companies give us. So the company prints the t-shirts and goes, we've handed out t-shirts with our mission statement. Aren't you excited? And then people go, well, I'm going to say I'm excited because everyone is looking at me, but actually it's a mission statement on a t-shirt. Come on. There's a little bit more at stake than this. I'm actually giving my best effort every day because X. And people find their different answers to X. But if the work doesn't make sense, it's very hard to find your way to your personal individual X. So uncertainty, lack of control, lack of belonging, displacement, lack of meaning. Those are the ways in which change undermines our ability to do our best work.
One of the people who came on the show was John Truby. He's a scriptwriter. He wrote the book, The Anatomy of Genres. And I almost sent that episode to you ahead of time, but I didn't want to just bury you in other episodes. And in it, we talked about the different genres. There's the Western and what you're trying to get done in a Western. There's the science fiction and what the hero's trying to get done in a science fiction. But one of them was, I said, layoffs, for instance, are horror stories. And he said, absolutely. And he said, that is a story that once you're in that story, you can't be in the other stories. It's the dominant story. And if you look at the ingredients, and he said, in fact, it's a slasher flick. That's what it is. That's what a layoff is. Your friends are disappearing, and you just notice they're gone, and there's no announcement. There's this monster let loose in the halls of the company. But think of what you just said and how many of those things would be a part of a horror story. Uncertainty, lack of control, unbelonging, displacement, and less meaning. So it's a really interesting correlation between those things. And do you want people to be in that story in your company?
And it's a fascinating comparison, because I'll tell you one feature that a horror flick has that ongoing change doesn't have. A horror flick has an ending. At some point, the credits roll, and you get to go about your life, and you don't have to be in that environment anymore. There's a lovely finding/hypothesis by the psychologist Martin Seligman that he calls the safety signal hypothesis. And he draws a distinction between fear and anxiety. And he says fear is negative emotion with an object. I'm afraid of a dog. I'm afraid of a... And when the object goes, the fear goes. Anxiety doesn't have an object. It's more free-floating, if you like. And so what we're looking for when we're in a state of anxiety is some signal, the safety signal, that things are okay now. So when you sit in the horror movie, of course, you're in a state of anxiety because you know you to be afraid. You know something miserable is going to happen next. You know you're not going to enjoy it very much. Although perversely, some people enjoy the not enjoying of it, but I never really understood that. So you're in a state of anxiety. You don't know, is the evil monster in this scene or not? But when the credits roll, you have a safety signal. It's okay now. It's really interesting to process organizational life and communication through the lens of attempts to create safety signals for people. Because I think a lot of leaders feel this intuitively. So we'll say things like, don't worry, it's okay, trust me, if you have any questions, come and ask. And these are all attempts to create safety signals. But of course, they're all undone by the next change that rolls around on its heels. And in the precise example of layoffs, of course, what leaders struggle to say is there will be no more layoffs. Once your company has said, we accept that layoffs for us are a tool of management and budget, then you can't unsay that. You can't. And then if you get into the habit of doing them every 2 or 3 years or every time there's an economic downturn, that uncertainty is a pervasive part of the environment. So you have created a low-level horror flick for your people.
I once was in a room of 300 people during layoffs, and there'd been a whole bunch of them already. And our C-level person came in and said, okay, everybody in this room, we're done. You're all safe. The next day, 2/3 were laid off. I talked to our comms person afterwards, and she said, oh my God, when that came out of her mouth, I thought, no one's ever going to believe you again. True that. My friends and I had long conversations saying, words have no meaning. There's no truth. You can't listen. And that was a really deep and enduring lesson.
I think this is, by the way, a point that's very specific to layoffs.
It is.
About the sort of perniciousness of the psychological environment that they create inside an organization. Because once that genie is out of the bottle, or it's not a genie, is it? Once that monster is out of the bottle, I don't know, lamp, thing, mixed metaphor. Once the mixed metaphor is out of the bottle, you really can't put it back in again. And I think companies tend to go, all right, well, it's a short-term thing. We will hire again in the future. It'll be a hard decision for people to hear, but frankly, those people are going to be not on the payroll anymore, so not a concern for us. I think if we could actually measure the impact of layoffs on the people who are not laid off, and if you figure out the area under that curve, because it goes on for a long time, you go to a company and you know if it's a layoff company or not a layoff company, we would discover that there is a lot of lost productivity that is unaccounted for underneath the psychological impact curve of layoffs. And you can't convincingly say, once you've done one, we're never going to do another one. There are, by the way, some companies who will not do layoffs and will say very clearly and haven't done layoffs. I mean, famously, HP, before Carly Fiorina arrived, was a company that had said, we're not going to do layoffs. When operating expenses got out of hand, they said to the employees, operating expenses are out of hand. What do you want to do about it? And people volunteered to take pay cuts. There are other ways. You can choose to report worse numbers to the street. It's usually not a loss. It's just less profit. So there are different things that companies can do. But I think we are a little bit naive when it comes to the ongoing effects of being in a company that does layoffs.
I was in a war room during the first big layoff at Cisco Systems. And this was 2001. So it was the dot-com bubble. It was apocalyptic in terms of the markets right then, and it had to happen. But John Chambers had said, Cisco will never lay anyone off. So he came to the war room just to give us a morale boost. He clearly had not slept in 3 days. And he was just impeccably dressed, because he always was, but you could see it in his face. He had not told the truth, and he cared. But you're right. It lasts a long time. There's a long effect in an organization of that. You've got a whole section of the book, which is rethink. And it's interesting in this conversation, I've changed my perspective on the rethink, because I thought that the rethink was a broader recommendation than the problem at the beginning of the book, which is change. It is in some sense, which it solves many things, the things that you recommend, and I'll read them out in a second. It does solve many other things. These are good things for humans. And so even if there's not a ton of change, but the way I'm starting to think of these is, sure, the ship may be in rough oceans. This is the ballast. And it's not saying there's not going to be any change. It's not saying that. It's saying, look, put these things in the bottom of your ship so that it can handle that sort of thing. And they are, I'm just going to read them out. Make space, forge undeniable competence, share secrets. That's a really interesting chapter. Be predictable, speak in real words, focused most on teams, and pave the way. And I'm not sure what unifies them. Maybe you can say what unifies those.
It's interesting to hear them read out loud. I wonder, for people listening, what the emotional affect of hearing that sequence of words is. And I would hope it's in itself a little ballast-y. I hope when you say forge undeniable competence, be predictable, honor ritual, I hope that feels like a list of very human things which would make the workplace a little bit more human. What connects them all? What connects them all is simply their impact. They make the world or they make the experience of the world, or they help the humans in the world be a little fortified against constant change. So, yeah, the argument of the book is not, unless we can stop change in the world, it's going to be miserable. That would be to misunderstand what I'm trying to say here. I'm trying to say there's lots of change that is superfluous that we can do away with, but lots is not all. And by the way, the line between superfluous and necessary is going to vary person to person to person to person to person. It's a judgment call. What do you do? The first thing is you say to leaders, be wary of change. Don't run towards it thoughtlessly. Understand that you are playing with fire. Understand that in unthinkingly embracing large-scale constant change, you are doing a whole bunch of things that make it harder for your employees to do the things you've hired them to do. That should give you pause. So pause. Now you've paused. You've said, yeah, but, and this is me many times in my career, I've actually been given an assignment which involves improvement. So there's going to be some change, and I think I can see the way to improvement. I think I've done my homework. So now we're going to begin a change process. So what do you do? My argument is, before you even get to that point, if you're building an organization that is healthy for humans, you need to be doing some things ongoingly, because that point will come. And then when you're saying, well, we've got a different way of doing this, or an improved way of doing this, or we are going to together focus on how to improve this, that the people hearing that message are living in an environment where they have agency, they have self-efficacy, they have belonging, they have a sense of control, they have a sense of predictability. Not an absolute sense of any of those things, but an enhanced sense of all of those things. And my argument is that enhancing those things for humans at work is the fundamental task of leadership.
How does this change the role of HR?
We were talking about moats before. There's a moat between leadership and employees. I think in a sense, the role of HR is to be a drawbridge. It's to bridge the moat. It is very difficult for leaders to know what it's like on the front lines because no one will tell them. It is today difficult for HR to know those things because people are suspicious of HR, because their experience of HR is you're an agent of the organization at the end of the day, and you are not an agent of me at the end of the day. But if HR were to rethink itself as primarily the advocate for the human needs of human beings at work, the productivity needs of productive humans at work, then HR could be the bridge over the moat. HR, if it got really, really good at listening, at data analysis, at survey science, so that HR could say, this is what's actually going on. If HR actually plugged itself into team leaders at scale, rather than a few business leaders, but if HR actually matched itself up so that every team leader in an organization had a designated HR person who they got to know, who they came to see as a coach, an advisor, a helper, then HR would get a lot of intelligence about what people were saying on the front lines and what people were struggling with on the front lines. So there is space for an organization to bridge the moat. And I think it should be the HR organization. And HR isn't that today. HR is stuck trying to be the responsible people advocating voice, but at the same time, knowing that its authority comes from doing the people aspects of the business challenges. So executing the layoff really, really well, or hiring people really, really well, or moving people from one place to another really, really well, or doing the reorg really, really well. There's a bigger space for HR, and organizations should demand that their HR people play this role, because if any smart leader is going to go, okay, yeah, it's true. I don't completely know what's going on the front lines. I don't know what it's like to experience the latest change initiative. I don't know whether we're doing a good job of helping people do their best work. I need help with this. HR could be that help for me.
You describe a Venn diagram in the book. And by the way, luckily this is a simple diagram. Podcasts are not a great platform for diagrams, just saying.
Well, neither are books, to be honest.
But a Venn diagram we can do. And there's two circles: what's good for the business, what is good for people. And you describe a situation in which everybody's been telling HR to get a seat at the table. And the seat of the table is at the center of what's good for the business. At least that's the way it's configured. I will say, I actually lay a lot of this philosophically at the feet of David Ulrich, which is become a strategic player for business leaders. And when it comes to people, strive for scale. Try to make serving the people as cheap as possible so that you can free up more dollars to serve the people at the table. And you're arguing for HR probably taking both of those roles, which is you need to be at two tables. And one of them absolutely is the business table, and one of them absolutely is the people table. I'd say they're the same. They're both business, but personally, I call them different customers. So that's my framing. It's the framing of the show, which is that work is a product, and there should be a part of the organization that's responsible for designing and delivering an extraordinary work experience product.
There's a lot of my book that's actually about and, that's not about or.
Yeah.
And we've been talking about it a little bit so far. We can have change in an organization, and we can have a set of experiences that allow humans to do their best work. But that's not how it's configured today. We can have things that are in the interests of the business, first circle, and things that are in the interests of the humans in the business, second circle. But that's not all the things, and we need to be smart about which things are in which circle. Layoffs are generally, well, no, layoffs are a bad example. Layoffs are generally not in the interest of the business if you look at the analysis, but maybe it feels like it at the moment. And they're not in the interest of the people. Lots of vacation time is massively in the interests of the people in the business and not very much in the interest of the business because you have to have more people because you got to pay people to do nothing. Sleep, increasingly, is in the interests of the humans and not in the interests of the business. And you get people working 60-hour, 80-hour, 90-hour, 120-hour weeks. It sounds silly to say sleep. Why are we talking about sleep? Well, because people are being asked to work more and more hours. That's manifestly in the interest of the business, especially for a salaried workforce. It's free labor. But it's not in the interest of the humans. So these things are different and differentiable. But we've generally said, HR, seat at the table, figure out how to do the people aspects of the business things. I'm saying, A, there's a whole different set of interests, and it might make sense to pay attention to those because when you pay attention to humans, you generally get greater quality and greater volume of contribution from people. But also, actually, interestingly, there's an intersection of the circles. There's a bunch of stuff that people love that organizations want people to do and love. So get really good at your job. People love improvement. People love to feel a sense of mastery. There are very few people who are like, I don't want to get any better at what I do. Most of us have a sort of intrinsic itch to improve at what we do. It feels good to develop mastery. Organizations want that too. People want to be part of great teams because you get a sense of belonging. You get a sense of identity. You get a sense of contribution. You get a sense of meaning. Organizations want great teams. So there are things that are in the intersection of the circles. So, top of the HR agenda should be all of those things, but also significant on the HR agenda should be being an advocate for the people, recognizing that there is a tension between what's in the interest of the business and what's in the interest of the people. And the way to deal with tension in the world is to say it out loud and address it and work through it rather than to pretend it's not there.
I have a diagram very similar to yours. I have a third circle on it, which is expensive. And so you overlay that, and there's a category of things that are good for the people and not expensive. Do those things. So I have a question. It's not really related to the book. It's related to an event that I often refer to, and I think you played a part in, which was when Cisco Systems stopped doing performance management.
We should say traditional performance management.
I should say traditional performance management. And I'll tell you where I was at the time, which is I was helping the team to redesign performance management. That's exactly where I was at that time. When Fran Katsoudas, Chief People Officer, said in an all hands, yeah, we're going to stop doing traditional performance management, I was like, there goes that project. But I thought it was the right idea. So when it happened, when that came down, I thought, it'll be interesting to see what happens. We are reliant on this belief in performance management. We have this idea that if you don't have performance management, people are not going to perform, and that we won't know how to treat people. And there's all these things that you feel are dependent in the world. And guess what happened? Nothing. We all saved a lot of time. For the very most part, it was like, it's fine. So yeah, what was your role in that? And what was the impetus?
I came along just after Fran had said that because I'd done some writing about how to do performance without ratings. And I'd introduced it at Deloitte and it worked very well. And so Fran and I were talking about that. And we can explain this phenomenon quite simply, that we got rid of ratings and things continued as before. Performance did not plummet. You can explain it with the two circles, if you like. Because if you say to the business, well, what are some of your interests in thinking about performance and humans? They will say things like, well, we want to know who the good humans are so that we can keep them, and the less good humans are so that we can kick them out. And we massively want to know that middle managers are being tough on people, because we suspect that middle managers are nice to people and tell everybody that they're doing a great job. But if the middle managers aren't being tough on some people, improvement won't occur, because improvement comes from telling people where they fall down at work. And so we need a system to make sure that middle managers, who we massively don't trust because we can't see them because they're on the other side of the moat, that middle managers are being tough on enough people. So we figure, I don't know, based on finger in the wind, we figure 20% of our people are no good. Now, we hired 100% of them, but 20% of the time we got it wrong. So we're going to make the middle managers tell 20% of the people by rule that they are no good, or that they're failing, or that they need to improve, and that will improve performance in the organization. Now, this is a sort of miserable effort, so we're only going to do it once a year because it's low performance is obviously a characteristic of a human, not a characteristic of a piece of work. And I'm being sarcastic in saying that. So we'll have a performance management system. There you go. We'll rate everybody once a year. We'll force people to give low ratings. We will solve the problems of feedback, and we'll solve the problems of middle managers not wanting to be mean to people. That's the business problem, said massively sarcastically, that performance management is solving. In circle 2, what are in the interests of human beings? You go to people and say, what would help you do better work? And weirdly, the things that they do not say are mandatory goal setting, an annual performance review, and a forced scale rating. What they say is more attention from my leader, a clearer understanding of what the organization is about, and organizational leadership that makes space for me to give my best contribution. They say things like that, none of which is addressed by traditional performance management systems. So what we did at Deloitte and then at Cisco is we said, never mind the force rating, never mind the consensus meeting, never mind the cascading goals, get rid of all of that, because that actually isn't solving a human performance problem. And so if you get rid of it, performance will not go down, which is true. Performance did not go down. How can we help performance go up? Well, we can speak to some of the things that people say they want. They want more attention from their leader. They want a clear understanding of how their work fits in. They want guidance on how to do better work. Okay, what solves for that? A weekly conversation about the work with your manager. So that's what we instituted in both those organizations. And not to pat myself on the back, but at Cisco, employee engagement was up 10% in 4 years after we started doing that.
Cisco hit number 1 on the Forbes.
Yeah, and it's a big shift, and employees love it, which tells you something. It's very rare that any business or HR organization institutes a bit of organizational ritual where when people have it taken away, they complain. There aren't many organizational things that people go, oh my God, can I have that back? Usually when you take away the process or the procedure or the whatever, people are like, thank you. But people who have gone from teams where the leader is very good at doing a weekly check-in to teams where the leader blows it off, complain about it. So it tells you that it's speaking to their interests, and the whole adventure with removing ratings and thinking about performance in a different way tells you that speaking to addressing the needs of employees lifts performance in an organization.
I really liked the conversations that took place instead of performance management. They were weekly. They asked people what they were working on this week. How can I help you to do that? Is there anything I can clear for you? What did you love and what did you loathe about the week? And I've expanded that particular question into a lot of my practice. I will ask you one of those questions as part of the close. And this is going to sound really cynical, but I actually have to be really careful not to diss HR. And the reason is I think HR has a really hard job. I'm part of HR. I know we have a hard job. So I don't want to throw rocks at HR, but I'm going to throw one, which is I think there's a bit of a con going on, which is that we put performance management into companies like putting a big rock underneath their mattress. And then the organization says, this rock's really uncomfortable. Can you make it less uncomfortable? And then we make a business out of moving the rock every few years underneath the mattress. It's natively uncomfortable. It's a rock under your mattress, but it's a complete career. You can spend a career moving that rock.
But here's the thing. You learn a profession from the people in the profession around you and from the organizational demands of your profession. So I learned at the beginning of my career in HR what a rating system was. I was tangentially involved in a project in my early days of HR at Deloitte to reinvent a competency model. And I didn't feel I was doing a bad thing by reinventing a competency model. I was young. I was learning from people around me. Professions are self-perpetuating in terms of their bodies of knowledge and their toolkits and their philosophies. I don't think it's fair to say to anybody, you've done the things you were told to do when you were coming up. Shame on you. That's a ridiculous thing to say. So I think anybody has to be curious about the conditions that make a profession what it is. And the reason that I write about HR fundamentally as an organization which could adopt for itself a different mission or an expanded mission is I think then that drives a different set of assumptions and philosophies and tools and approaches that could make a productive change. But I don't think we need to criticize people for doing the things that they were taught to do when they were coming up, because you and I are both members of that group.
That's true. Yeah, that's absolutely true. So in close, I always ask a few common questions. One of them is, what do you hire your work to do for you?
Fundamentally, to make me useful. It's a lovely feeling to feel that you've been useful. And by the way, I'm not saying transformative or visionary or revolutionary. My bar is useful. Useful. Increase the amount of goodness in the world by 1 iota. I hire my work to help me do those things because it's one way that I've found I can be useful. And it's simultaneously what I hire my work to do. And I think a very good yardstick. Do I feel that this is useful? Well, how do I know? Well, I should go and talk to some people and figure out whether they found the thing was useful or not. It's a nice, provable, testable thing in the world. And it's also, for me, a reminder that not everything that we do is useful. That actually it's a simple thing and a clear thing and a identifiable thing, if you like. But it's also not necessarily a common thing. You can get through a day and go, did I do anything useful today? And sometimes you're like, I don't know, the jury might be out for a little bit longer on my usefulness today or not. But work is, for me, a way to transmute a set of ideas, experiences, knowledge, understandings, instincts, and tropisms into things that might be useful for other people.
I like the word useful. I have found that responses to that question break in two. I like to help others, which can be one-on-one. And then the other one is I like to fix the world, which is that the world is out of shape. You may have both, but most of the work that I've seen you doing is I think that I can productively tweak the way the world works.
I think there's a useful thing here. Yeah. You know, my nature is a little bit contrarian and a little bit, let's get back to basics, which seem on the surface to push in opposite directions, but There's a lot of the world that I think we've overcomplicated, in which case contrarian and back to basics feel like the same thing, or not back to basics, but back to the roots of the issue, back to a fundamental understanding, back to the essence. That's a broad descriptor of the sort of work that I have found myself in, but I find myself in it because it feels useful. Not every day, by the way. Sometimes it's a more difficult path, I think, but I don't do it because it's difficult. I do it because I feel it's useful.
And there must be an aspect of it where you also just enjoy finding the deeper truth.
Oh, massively.
That joy of discovery of the deeper thing.
This project about change is a meta instance of that, because I didn't start by going, I know the science of change and I know why change is tough on the human creature. I started with, oh my goodness me, there's got to be a deeper truth here, because on the one hand, I'm looking at people whose lives have been turned upside down by change, who are miserable at work, who are distracted a lot of the time, who are finding it hard to do their jobs. And on the other hand, a received wisdom of leadership that's all about change. So that dissonance is enough for me to get going on something. It's then lovely for me, not for the people in it, but it's lovely for me to pull on that thread and go, oh, there are some truths of human psychology that we've overlooked or mistaken or forgotten. There are some truths of organizational structure and large-scale incentives that are unhelpful for us. And there are some ways to create stability for humans at work that will be helpful for those people at scale that don't require us to stop all change. Wow, that's lovely and precious and, in the way of importance, essential that we should do those things.
What does your job cost you or your work?
For me, cost is a little bit black and white. I'd rather say, what are some of the occupational hazards of doing what I do? Or what are some of the things I've learned that it's useful to be able to live with? Chief amongst them is that if you are being prescriptive about the world of work in some way, or about any world, but I'm prescriptive about the world of work, we ought to do this, we ought not to do this. And you are a person who believes himself to have some degree of integrity, then you have to keep asking yourself, am I right? Is all this stuff I'm saying right? Do I think I've got it? And when you go off and write for 2 years, you have to live for a long time in the faith of your own rightness without a whole bunch of the evidence of your own rightness. And so I've had different jobs over my career. My current job is I've written a book. And my job before that was writing a book. That's very different from being an executive or a consultant or an advisor or a speaker or any of the other things. But the occupational hazard of thinking at book length about something is it takes a long time. And during that time, you have to carry with you the little candle light that you're on the right path. And you have to be comfortable asking yourself a lot, am I on the right path? And not being put off by the need to keep questioning and keep refining and keep boiling things down until, again, you get back to the essence. You get down to the bedrock of what it is that you're trying to talk about. That's not a cost because it's an investment. So some costs are, here we go. There's an Ashley and comment again, right? Not all costs are investments, but all investments are costs. So it's an investment in producing something worthwhile. And it's not always fun to live through, but it's something that it's a big part of how I think about what I've been doing.
I really like that distinction between cost and investment. I will hope to use that later. That's really good. That's really helpful. Where can people learn more about you and your book?
People can learn what's inside the book by buying it at any place the books are sold around the world.
Let's right now say what it's called, The Problem with Change. And the subtitle is The Essential Nature of Human Performance.
There we go. I should have probably mentioned that, but yes. So people can buy The Problem with Change wherever good books are sold. And People can find me on my website, which I have conveniently entitled ashleygoodall.com. And if people want to find out more about what's going on and my thoughts, emerging thoughts and activities in the world, I am a frequent poster on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for coming on the show. I will promote this book as much as I possibly can. I think it's a really important thing to be in the world.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation, so thank you.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.